Donna Tartt's The Little Friend. Beginning of chapter 6, I believe. Chapter 5, I'm wrong. Page 297. Situation's got the best of me. Here's my chance, and I'll make it free. And break away from these waves I see. You're trying to stop, but I won't until I'm on the top. You're trying to stop, but I won't until I'm on the top. Got to. Hello, Brobs. We're back with The Little Friend by Donna Tartt, start of chapter 5. I know everyone's excited. All 7 people who will shortly leave, but that's fine with me. I don't care. I don't care what you do. The red gloves. The next morning, Harriet woke late, itchy, unbathed, in gritty sheets, the smell in the crawl space, the colorful boxes all jewelly with nail heads. The long shadows in the lighted doorway, all this and more, had bled into her sleep and mixed oddly with the pen and ink illustrations from her dime store edition of Ricky Tikki Tavi. Big-eyed Teddy, the mongoose, even the snakes, rendered perky and adorable. There had been some poor creature tied up and thumping at the bottom of the page, like an end plate to a storybook. It was in pain. It needed her assistance in ways she could not divine, but though its very presence was a reproach, a reminder of her own laxity and injustice, she was too repulsed to help it or even look in its direction. "Ignore it, Harriet," sang Edie. She and the preacher were in the corner of her bedroom by the chest of drawers, setting up a torture contraption, which was like a dentist's chair with needles prickling from the padded arms and headrest. In some distressing way, they seemed like sweethearts. Eyebrows lifted, full of admiring glances for each other, Edie testing the needle points, here and there with a delicate fingertip, as the preacher stepped back, grinning fondly, his hands crossed over his chest and tucked beneath his armpits. You fatality. As Harriet fretfully slid back into the stagnant waters of nightmare, Healy woke bolt upright in the top bunk, so fast that he knocked his head on the ceiling. Without thinking, he threw his legs over and nearly fell, for he'd been so freaked out the night before about what might climb up after him, he'd unhitched the ladder and pushed it over on the carpet. Self-consciously, as if he'd stumbled on the playground and people were watching, he righted himself and hopped to the floor and was out of his dark, air-conditioned little room and halfway down the hall before it struck him how silent the house was. He crept downstairs to the kitchen, nobody around, driveway empty, his mom's car keys gone, and poured himself a bowl of Giggle Pops and took it to the family room and switched on the television. A game show was on. He slurped up the cereal. Though the milk was cold enough, the crunchy pebbles scratched the roof of his mouth. They were strangely tasteless, not even sweet. The silent house made Healy uncomfortable. He was reminded of the awful morning after he and his older cousin Todd had taken a bottle of rum from a paper bag in the front seat of someone's unlocked Lincoln at the country club and drunk about half of it, while Healy and Todd's parents stood chatting at the poolside luau, nibbling cocktail sausages on toothpicks. He and Todd borrowed a golf cart, rammed it into a pine tree. Though Healy remembered very little of this, the main thing he remembered was lying on his side and rolling down a steep hill behind the golf course over and over again. Later, when his stomach started hurting, Todd told him to go to the buffet and eat as many cocktail weenies as fast as he could, and that would make it stop. He'd vomited on his knees in the parking lot behind somebody's Cadillac, while Todd laughed so hard that his mean, freckled face turned tomato red. Though Healy didn't remember it, somehow he'd walked home and got in his bed and gone to sleep. When he woke the next morning, the house was empty. They'd all gone to Memphis without him to drive Todd and his parents back to the airport. It had been the longest day of Healy's life. He'd had to clatter around the house by himself for hours, lonesome, nothing to do, trying to piece together exactly what happened the night before and worrying that he was in for a terrible punishment when his parents returned. What's up, Dog Day? Which indeed he was. He'd had to hand over all his birthday money to help pay for the damage. His parents had to pay for most of it. He'd had to write a letter of apology to the owner of the golf cart. He'd lost his TV privileges for what seemed like forever, but worst was his mother wondering aloud where he had learned to be a thief. It's not so much the liquor, she must have said it to his father 1,000 times, as him stealing it. His father made no such distinctions. He acted if Healy had robbed a bank. For ages, he had hardly spoken to Healy except to say things like, past assault, wouldn't even look at him, and life at home had never gone back to quite the same it was before. Typically, Todd, Mr. Musical Genius, first chair clarinet, in his Illinois junior high band, had blamed everything on Healy, which had been the way throughout their childhoods whenever they saw each other, thankfully not often. A celebrity guest had just said a bad word on the game show, some rhyming game. The contestants had to come up with the rhyming word that completed a riddle. The host blipped it out, the bad word, with an obnoxious noise like a dog's squeaky toy and wagged a finger at the celebrity guest, who clapped a hand over her mouth and rolled her eyes. Where the hell were his parents? Why didn't they just come on home and get it over with? Naughty, naughty, said the laughing host. The other celebrity on the panel had reared back in his chair and was clapping appreciatively. He tried to stop thinking about the night before. The memory clouded and followed the morning like the aftertaste of a bad dream. He tried to tell himself that he hadn't done anything wrong, not really, hadn't damaged property or hurt anyone or taken anything that didn't belong to him. There was the snake, but they hadn't really taken it. It was still under the house. And he'd set the other snakes loose, but so what? It was Mississippi. Snakes were crawling all over the place anyway. Who was going to notice a few more? All he'd done was open a latch, one latch. What was the big deal about that? It wasn't like he'd stolen the golf cart from a city councilman and wrecked it. Ding went the bell. Time for today's tiebreaker. The contestants, eyes darting, stood gulping before the big board. What did they have to worry about? Healy thought bitterly. He hadn't spoken to Harriet after his escape. Wasn't even sure she'd made it home. Something else that was starting to worry him. As soon as he ducked out of the yard, he darted to the opposite side of the street and run home. Over fences and through backyards, dogs barking at him from what seemed like all directions in the dark. When he'd crept in the back door, red-faced and panting, he saw by the clock on the stove that it was still early, only 9. He could hear his parents watching television in the family room. Now this morning, he wished he had stuck his head into the family room and said something to them, called out good night from the stairs, anything, but he had not the nerve to face them and had scurried cravenly to bed without a word to anyone. He had no desire to see Harriet. Her very name made him think about things which he would rather not. The family room, tan rug, corduroy sofa, tennis trophies in a case behind the wet bar, all seemed alien, unsafe, rigidly as if some hostile observer were glowering at his back from the doorway. He stared at the carefree celebrities conferring over their riddle and tried to forget his troubles. No Harriet, no snakes, no punishment imminent from his dad. No big, scary rednecks who had recognized him. He was certain of it. What if they went to his father, or worse, came after him? Who could say what a nut like Ferris Ratliff might do? A car pulled up in the driveway. Healy nearly screamed, but when he looked out the window, he saw it wasn't the Ratliffs. It was only his dad. Quickly, spasmodically, he attempted to slouch down and spread out, and generally arrange himself in a more casual posture. But he could not make himself comfortable, cringing in expectation of the slammed door, his father's footsteps clipping fast down the hallway the way they always did when he was angry and meant business. Healy, trembling with the effort, tried hard not to hold himself too stiffly, but he could not contain his curiosity, and he sneaked a terrified glance to see that his father, with maddening leisure, was just climbing out of the car. He seemed unconcerned, even bored, though his expression was hard to read through the gray sunshades which were clipped over his glasses. Unable to tear his eyes away, Healy watched him as he circled to the back of the car, opened the trunk. One by one, he unloaded his purchases in the empty sunlight and set them down on the concrete. A gallon of paint, plastic buckets, a coil of green garden hose. Healy got up very quietly and took his cereal bowl to the kitchen and rinsed it out. Then went up to his room and shut the door. He lay on the bottom bunk, staring at the slats above and trying not to hyperventilate or pay too much attention to his own heartbeat. Presently, he heard footsteps. Outside the door, his father said, "Healy? Sir? Why is my voice so squeaky? I thought I told you to turn off that television when you were finished watching it." "Yes, sir. I want you to come out and help me water your mother's garden. I thought it was going to rain this morning, but it looks like it's blown over." Healy was afraid to argue. He detested his mother's flower garden. Ruby, the maid before Essie Lee, would not go anywhere near the dense perennials his mother grew for cutting. "Snakes like flowers," she always said. Healy put on his tennis shoes and went outside. The sun was already high and hot, glare in his eyes, woozy with heat. He stood 7 or 8 feet back on the crisp yellow grass as he swept the house over the flower bed, holding it as far away from his body as he could. "Where's your bicycle?" said his father, returning from the garage. Healy's heart sank. His bike was right where he'd left it, on the median in front of the frame house. "How many times do I have to tell you, don't come back in this house until it's in the garage? I'm sick and tired of telling you not to leave it out in the yard." Something was wrong when Harriet went downstairs. Her mother was dressed in one of the cotton shirt-waist dresses she wore to church and was whisking around the kitchen. "Here," she said, presenting Harriet with some cold toast and a glass of milk. Ida, her back to Harriet, was sweeping the floor in front of the stove. "Are we going somewhere?" said Harriet. "No, darling." Though her mother's voice was cheerful, her mouth was slightly tense, and the waxy coral lipstick she wore made her face look white. "I just thought I'd get up and make your breakfast for you this morning. Is that all right?" Harriet glanced over her shoulder at Ida, who did not turn around. The set of her shoulders was peculiar. "Something's happened to Edie," thought Harriet, stunned. "Edie's in the hospital." Before she had time for this to sink in, Ida, without looking at Harriet, stooped with the dustpan, and Harriet saw with a shock that she'd been crying. All the fear of the past 24 hours came thundering down upon her, and along with it was a fear that she could not name. Timidly, she asked, "Where's Edie?" Harriet's mother looked puzzled. "At home," she said. "Why?" The toast was cold, but Harriet ate it anyway. Her mother sat down at the table with her and watched her, with her elbows on the table and her chin propped in her hands. Is it good? She said presently. Yes, ma'am. Because she did not know what was wrong or how to act, Harriet concentrated all her attention upon her toast. Then her mother sighed. Harriet glanced up just in time to see her rise from the table in a rather dispirited manner and drift from the room. Ida, whispered Harriet, as soon as they were alone. Ida shook her head and said nothing. Her face was expressionless, but big glassy tears swelled at the bottom lid of her eyes. Then pointedly she turned away. Harriet was stricken. She stared at Ida's back, at the apron straps crisscrossed over her cotton dress. She could hear all sorts of tiny noises, crystal clear and dangerous, the hum of the refrigerator, a fly buzzing over the kitchen sink. Ida dumped the dustpan into the pail beneath the sink, then shut the cabinet. What for you told on me, she said without turning around. Tell on you? I'm always good to you. Ida brushed past her, returned the dustpan to its home on the floor by the hot water heater next to the mop and broom. Why you want to get me in trouble? Tell on you for what? I didn't. You sure did. And you know what else? Harriet quailed as her steady, bloodshot gaze. You all got that poor woman fired over at Mr. Claude Hall's house. Yes, you did, she said over Harriet's stutters of astonishment. Mr. Claude drove over there last night, and you should have heard how he talked to that poor woman like she's a dog. I heard the whole thing, and so did Charlie T. I didn't. Listen at you, Ida hissed. You ought to be ashamed telling Mr. Claude that woman tried to set the house on fire. And what you do then, but push yourself on home and tell your mama that I don't feed you right. I didn't tell on her. It was Healy. I ain't talking about him. I'm talking about you. But I told him not to tell. We were in his room, and she banged on the door and started yelling. Yes, and what you do then, but come home and tell on me, your own self. You was mad at me when I left yesterday because I didn't want to sit around after work telling stories. Don't say you wasn't. Ida, you know how Mama gets mixed up. All I said was, I'll tell you why you did it. You's mad and spiteful that I don't sit around all night cooking fried chicken and telling stories when I gots to get home and do my own work after cleaning up for you folks all day. Harriet went outside. The day was hot, sun-bleached, soundless. She felt as she just had a tooth filled at the dentist's, pain blooming plumb back in her rear molars, walking through the glass doors into the glare and withering heat of the parking lot. Harriet, is somebody waiting to pick you up? Yes, ma'am, Harriet always said to the receptionist, whether somebody was waiting or not. From the kitchen, all was silence. The shutters of her mother's room were closed. Was Ida fired? Somehow, incredibly, the question caused her no pain or anxiety, only the same dull puzzlement as when she bit hard on the inside of her cheek after a Novocaine shot, and it didn't hurt. I'll pick her some tomatoes for lunch, said Harriet to herself, and squinting against the glare, went to the side of the house to Ida's little vegetable garden, an unfenced plot 12 feet square, badly in need of weeding. Ida didn't have space for a garden where she lived. Though she made them tomato sandwiches every day, she took most of the other vegetables home with her. Almost daily, Ida offered Harriet a kindness of some sort in exchange for help in the garden, a game of checkers, a story, which Harriet always refused. She hated yard work, could not bear the dust on her hands, or the beetles, or the heat, or the stinging hairs on the squash vines, which made her legs itch. Now her selfishness made her feel sick. Many painful thoughts clustered about, pricking at her ceaselessly. Ida had to work hard all the time, not just here, but at her own house. What did Harriet ever have to do? Some tomatoes, she'll like that. She picked some bell peppers too, and okra, and a fat black eggplant. The summer's first. She piled the muddy vegetables in a small cardboard box and then set to work weeding, gritting her teeth with displeasure. Vegetable plants, save only for the vegetables, looked like overgrown weeds to her, with their sprawling habits and rough, ungainly leaves. So she left what she wasn't sure about and only pulled the weeds she was certain of, clover and dandelion, easy, and long switches of Johnson grass, which Ida had a tricky way of folding, so they made a shrill, unearthly whistle when she put them between her lips and blew a certain way. But the blades were sharp, and it was not long before one of them had sliced a red seam, like a paper cut, across the base of her thumb. Harriet, sweating, reared back on her dusty heels. She had some red cloth gardening gloves, child size, which Ida Rue had bought for her at the hardware store last summer. It had made her feel terrible even to think about them. Ida didn't have much money, certainly not enough to spend on presents, even worse, Harriet disliked the garden so much that she had never worn the gloves, not once. Don't you like them little gloves I gave you? Ida had asked her rather sadly one afternoon while they were sitting on the porch. When Harriet protested, she shook her head. I do like them, I do. I wear them to play in. You don't have to tell me a story, baby. I'm just sorry you don't care anything about them. Harriet's face burned. The red gloves had cost $3. For poor Ida, nearly a day's work. Now that she thought about it, she realized that the red gloves were the only present that Ida had ever given her, and she had lost them. How could she have been so careless? For a long time in the winter, they had lain neglected in a galvanized tub in the tool shed, with the pruning shears and the hedge clippers, and some other tools of Chester's. She left her weeding uprooted shoots scattered harum-scarum across the dirt, and hurried to the tool shed, but the gloves weren't in the galvanized tub. They were in Chester's tool bench either. They weren't in Chester's tool bench either. They weren't on the shelf with the flower pots and fertilizer. They weren't behind the cake tins of varnish and spackle and house paint. On the shelves, she found badminton rackets, pruning shears, and handsaw, numberless extension cords, a yellow plastic hard hat like construction workers wore, more garden tools of every description, loppers, rose snips, weed fork, and shrub rake, and 3 different sizes of trowel. Chester's own gloves, but not the gloves that Ida had given her. She could feel herself getting hysterical. Chester knows where they are, she told herself. I'll ask him. Chester only worked on Mondays, and other days worked either for the county, pulling weeds and cutting grass in the cemetery, or at odd jobs around town. She was breathing hard in the dusty, gasoline-smelling dimness, staring at the litter of tools on the oily floor and wondering where to look next, for she had to find the red gloves. I have to, she thought, her eyes darting over the mess. I'll die if I've lost them. When Healy ran up and poked his head in the door. Harriet, he gasped, clinging to the doorframe. We've got to go get the bikes. Bikes, said Harriet, after a confused silence. They're still there. My dad noticed my bike was gone. He's going to whip me if I've lost it. Come on. Harriet tried to focus her attention on the bicycles, but all she could think of were the gloves. I'll go later, she said at last. No, now I'm not going by myself. Well, wait a little while now. No, Healy wailed. We have to go now. Look, I've got to go in and wash my hands. Put all this junk back on the shelf for me, okay? Healy stared at the jumble on the floor. All of it? Do you remember some red gloves I used to have? They used to be in that bucket there. Healy looked at her with apprehension, like she was crazy. Garden gloves, red cloth with elastic at the wrist. Harriet, I'm serious. The bikes have been outside all night. They might not even be there anymore. If you find them, just tell me, all right? She ran back to the vegetable bed and tossed the weeds she'd pulled into a big, careless pile. Never mind, she told herself. I'll clean it up later. Then she snatched up the box of vegetables and ran back into the house. Ida wasn't in the kitchen. Quickly, without soap, Harriet rinsed the dirt off her hands at the sink. Then she carried the box into the living room, where she found Ida sitting in her tweed chair, with her knees apart and her head in her hands. Ida, Harriet said timidly. Stiffly, Ida Rue swung her head around. Her eyes were still red. I brought you something, Harriet stammered. She set the cardboard box down on the floor by Ida's feet. Dully, Ida stared down at the vegetables. What am I going to do? She said, and shook her head. Where will I go? You can take them home if you want to, said Harriet helpfully. She picked up the eggplant to show it to Ida. Your mama say I don't do a good job. How I'm supposed to do a good job when she got newspapers and trash stacked clear up the walls? Ida picked up the corner of her apron and wiped her eyes on it. All she pays me is $20 a week, and that ain't right. Odeon over at Mrs. Libby's gets 35, and she ain't got a mess like this, nor 2 children to fool with either. Harriet's hands felt useless, dangling at her side. She longed to hug Ida, to kiss her cheek, to fall in her lap, and burst into tears. Yet something in Ida's voice and in the tense, unnatural way that Ida sat made her afraid to come any closer. Your mama she say, y'all are big now and don't need looking after anymore. Use both in school, and after school you all can take care of yourselves. Their eyes met, Ida's red and teary. Harriet's round and ringing with horror, and stayed together for a moment that Harriet would remember until she died. Ida looked away first. And she's right, she said in a more resigned voice. Allison's in high school, and you don't need anybody to stay at home all day and watch out for you anymore. You's in school most of the year anyway. I've been in school for 7 years. Well, that's what she tell me. Harriet dashed upstairs to her mother's room and ran in without knocking. She found her mother sitting on the side of the bed and Allison on her knees, crying with her face pressed into the bedspread. When Harriet came in, she raised her head and, with swollen eyes, gave Harriet a look so anguished that it took her aback. Not you too, said her mother. Her voice was blurred and her eyes drowsy. Leave me alone, girls. I want to lie down for a minute. You can't fire Ida. Well, I like Ida too, girls, but she doesn't work for free, and lately it seems as if she's dissatisfied. These were all things that Harriet's father said. Her voice was slow and mechanical, as if she were reciting a memorized speech. You can't fire her, repeated Harriet shrilly. Your father says, so what? He doesn't live here. Well, girls, you'll have to talk to her yourself. Ida agrees with me that neither of us are happy with the way things have been working out around here. There was a long pause. Why'd you tell Ida that I told on her? Harriet said. What'd you say? We'll talk about this later. Charlotte swung around and lay down on the bed. No, now. Don't worry, Harriet, Charlotte said. She closed her eyes. And don't cry, Allison. Please don't. I can't stand it, she said. Her voice trailing fitfully away. It'll all work out, I promise. Screaming, spitting, scratching, biting, none of these were adequate to the rage that blazed up in Harriet. She stared down at her mother's serene face. Peacefully, her chest rose. Peacefully, her chest fell. Moisture glistened on her upper lip. When the coral lipstick had faded and feathered up into the tiny wrinkles, her eyelids were oily and bruised looking, with deep hollows like thumbprints at the inner corner. Harriet went downstairs, leaving Allison at her mother's bedside, smacking the banister with her hand. Ida was still in her chair and staring out the window with her cheek cupped in her palm. And as Harriet stopped in the doorway and gazed at her sorrowfully, Ida seemed to glow up out of her surroundings with a merciless reality. Never had she seemed quite so palpable, so fixed and robust and marvelously solid. Her chest, beneath the thin gray cotton of her faded dress, heaved powerfully with her breath. Impulsively, Harriet started over to the chair, but Ida, the tears still glistening on her cheeks, turned her head and gave her a look that stopped her where she stood. For a long time, the two of them looked at each other. The two of them had had staring contests since Harriet was small. It was a game, a test of wills, something to laugh about, but this time it was no game. Everything was wrong and terrible, and there was no laughter when Harriet, at last, was forced to drop her eyes in shame. And in silence, for there was nothing else to do, Harriet hung her head and walked away with the beloved, sorrowful eyes burning into her back. What's wrong? Said Healy when he saw Harriet's dull, dazed expression. He'd been about to let her have it for taking so long, but the look on her face made him feel sure that they were both in big, big trouble, the worst trouble of their lives. Mother wants to fire Ida. Tough, said Healy agreeably. Harriet looked at the ground, trying to remember how her face worked and her voice sounded when everything was okay. Let's get the bikes later, she said, and she was heartened by how casual her voice came out sounding. No, my dad's going to kill me. Tell him you left it over here. I can't just leave it out there. Somebody will steal it. Look, you told me you would, said Healy despairingly. Just walk over there with me. Oh, Lord. Okay, but first you have to promise. Harriet, please. I put all this junk for you and everything. Promise you'll go back with me tonight for the box. Where are you going to take it, said Healy, brought up short. We can't hide it at my house. Harriet held up both hands, no fingers crossed. Fine, said Healy, and held his hands up too. It was their own private sign language, as binding as any spoken promise. Then he turned and broke into a fast walk through the yard and down to the street with Harriet right behind him. Sticking close to the shrubbery and ducking behind trees, they were within 40 feet or so of the frame house when Healy seized Harriet's wrist and pointed. On the median, a long spike of chrome glinted from beneath the unwieldy spread of the summer sweet bush. Cautiously they advanced. The driveway was empty. Next door at the house belonging to the dog Pancho and his mistress, was parked the white county car, which Harriet recognized as Mr. Dorrier's. Every Tuesday at 3:45, Mrs. Dorrier's white sedan rolled slowly up to Libby's house, and out stepped Mrs. Dorrier in her blue health service uniform, come to take Libby's blood pressure, pumping the cuff tight around Libby's little bird-boned arm, counting the seconds on her large masculine wristwatch, while Libby, who was unspeakably distressed by anything remotely to do with medicine or illness or doctors, sat gazing at the ceiling, her eyes filling with tears behind her glasses, her hands pressed to her chest and her mouth trembling. "Let's do it," Healy said, glancing over his shoulder. Harriet nodded at the sedan. "The nurse is over there," she whispered. "Wait till she leaves." They waited behind the tree. After a couple of minutes, Healy said, "What's taking so long?" "Don't know," said Harriet, who was wondering the same thing herself. Mrs. Dorrier had patients all over the county and was in and out of Libby's in a flash, never loitering to chat or have a cup of coffee. "I'm not waiting here all day," Healy whispered, but then across the street the screen door opened and out stepped Mrs. Dorrier in her white cap and blue uniform. Following was the sun-baked Yankee woman in dirty scuffs and a parrot green house dress, with poncho hooked over her arm. $2 a pill," she squawked. "I'm taking $14 of medicine a day," I said to that boy down there at the pharmacist's. "Medicine is expensive," said Mrs. Dorrier politely, and turned to go, but she was tall and thin, about 50, with a gray streak in her black hair and very correct posture. I said, "Son, I got emphysema. I got gallstones. I got arthritis. What's your problem, Ponch?" she said to Poncho, who had stiffened in her grasp, his gigantic ears cocked straight out from the side of his head. Even though Harriet was hidden behind the tree, he still seemed to see her. His lemur-like eyes were fixed directly on her. He bared his teeth at her and then, with rabid ferocity, began to bark and struggle to get away. The woman whacked him with the flat of her palm across the top of his head. "Shut your trap." Mrs. Dorrier laughed, slightly uncomfortable, and picked up her bag and started down the steps. "Next Tuesday, then. He's all worked up," called the woman, still wrestling with Poncho. "We had a winder peeper last night, and the police come next door." "Great day." Mrs. Dorrier paused at the door of her sedan. "You don't mean it." Poncho was still barking up a storm. As Mrs. Dorrier got in her car and slowly rolled away, the woman, standing on the sidewalk now, whacked Poncho again, then carried him inside and slammed the door. Healy and Harriet waited for a moment or two, breathless, and when they were sure that no cars were coming, they dashed across the street to the grassy median and dropped to their knees by the bicycles. Harriet jerked her head at the driveway of the frame house. Nobody's home over there. The stone in her chest had lifted somewhat, and she felt lighter now, level and swift. With a grunt, Healy wrenched his bicycle free. "I need to get that snake from under there." The brusqueness of her voice made him feel sorry for her without understanding why. He stood his bike up. Harriet was astride her own bicycle, glaring at him. "We'll come back," he said, avoiding her gaze. He hopped on, and together they kicked off and glided down the street. Harriet overtook him and passed aggressively, cutting them off at the corner. She was acting like she just had the shit beaten out of her, he thought, looking after her hunched low on the bike and pedaling furiously down the street like Dennis Pete. Or Tommy Scoggs, mean kids who beat up on smaller kids and got beaten up themselves by larger ones. Maybe it was because she was a girl, but when Harriet got in these mean daredevil moods, it excited him. The thought of the cobra excited him too, and though he didn't feel comfortable explaining to Harriet, not yet, that he had set a half-dozen rattlesnakes loose in the apartment, it had just occurred to him that the frame house was empty. It might be for some time. That's going to be it, bruvs. Goodbye. Goodbye.